my name is Reagan. Welcome to the Twisted States podcast. Thank you for joining us for episode 5 in our first season of Twisted States, where each week we take a look, state by state, at some of America's most nefarious killers, elusive cryptids, and bizarre mysteries. This week we are headed to Oregon. A little bit about Oregon. Take a little peep at her backstory before we get into the goodies. Oregon became the 33rd state of the U.S. on February 14th, 1859. Until 1970, anyone could buy or make dynamite in Oregon. Due to the high demand for beaver hats and coats and unregulated trapping during the early settlement years, beavers were nearly eliminated by mid-19th century. It's okay though, because since then, proper management has allowed the semi-aquatic mammals to flourish once again. Known as the Beaver State, Oregon features a picture of a beaver on the back of its state flag. Beginning in 1836, roughly 12,000 immigrants made the 2,000-mile trek from Independence, Missouri to the Oregon Territory. Heavily traveled until 1884, the Oregon Trail was the most used of all routes in the westward expansion of the United States. Mount Hood, a dormant volcano that last erupted around 1865, is covered by 12 glaciers. At 11,239 feet, it is the tallest peak in Oregon. In November of 1986, the 80-mile-long Columbia River Gorge, which traverses the border between Oregon and Washington, was designated the country's first national scenic area. Since the mixture of cool marine air on the western side of the Cascades and the drier air from the inland basin creates a natural wind tunnel, the gorge is considered to be one of the best places in the world for windsurfing. That's pretty cool. Oregon grows 99% of all hazelnuts produced in the United States. It's also the country's leading producer of Christmas trees, with an output of more than 4.9 million trees in 2009. Oregon's Crater Lake, formed in the remnant of an ancient volcano, is the deepest lake in the United States. So Oregon definitely has a very unique and diverse landscape. There's a lot going on there, volcanoes and such. So this week, whilst in Oregon, we're going to take a look at a rather notorious story that a lot of people are really familiar with, but I still find very interesting and intriguing. And I recently took the time to sit down and actually look over the FBI files that were made public on this case. And I don't know, it just kind of holds my interest. And it's not your usual, like, crazy, horrific story. You'll see what I mean. Anyway, so let's go ahead and get into it, okay? This week we're talking about D.B. Cooper, or Dan Cooper. Yeah, that guy. Hijacking. On Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971, a middle-aged man carrying a black attaché case approached the flight counter of Northwest Orient Airlines at Portland International Airport. He identified himself as Dan Cooper and used cash to purchase a one-way ticket on Flight 305, a 30-minute trip north to Seattle. Cooper boarded the aircraft, a Boeing 727-100, FAA registration N467US, took seat 18C, or 18E or 15D, depending on who you ask. They were giving kind of conflicted information on which seat he actually sat in. He ordered a bourbon and soda, and eyewitnesses described a man wearing a business suit with a black tie and white shirt, appearing to be in his mid-40s. Flight 305 departed Portland approximately one-third full, right on time at 2:50 p.m., Pacific Standard Time. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a note to Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant nearest to him, in a jump seat. Assuming the paper contained a lonely businessman's phone number, Schaffner dropped it unopened into her purse. Cooper leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note was printed in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen. Its exact wording is unknown because Cooper later reclaimed it, but Schaffner recalled that it mentioned the bomb and directed her to sit in the seat beside Cooper. Schaffner did as requested, then quietly asked to see the bomb. Cooper opened his briefcase long enough for her to glimpse 8 red cylinders, 4 on top of 4, attached to wires coated with red insulation and a large cylindrical battery. After closing the briefcase, he stated his demands: $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft upon arrival. Schaffner conveyed Cooper's instructions to the pilots in the cockpit. When she returned, Cooper was wearing dark sunglasses. The captain, William A. Scott, 1920 to 2001, contacted Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control, which informed local and federal authorities. 35 other passengers were told that their arrival in Seattle would be delayed because of a minor mechanical difficulty. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow recalled that Cooper appeared familiar with the local terrain. He was remarking on landmarks, and he also correctly mentioned the distance between the Air Force Base was only a 20-minute drive from Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Schaffner described him as calm, polite, and well-spoken, not at all consistent with the stereotypes popularly associated with air piracy at the time. He wasn't nervous, Mucklow told investigators. He seemed rather nice. He was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm all the time. He ordered a second bourbon and soda, paid his drink tab, and attempted to give Mucklow the change, and offered to request meals for the flight crew during the stop in Seattle. FBI agents assembled the ransom money from several Seattle area banks and made a microfilm photograph of each of the 10,000 unmarked $20 bills. Cooper rejected the military-issue parachutes offered by McChord Air Force Base personnel. Instead, he demanded civilian parachutes with manually operated ripcords. Seattle police obtained them from a local skydiving school. Passengers released. At 5:24 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Cooper was informed that his demands had been met, and at 5:39 p.m., the aircraft landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport more than an hour after sunset. Cooper instructed Scott to taxi the jet to an isolated, brightly lit section of the apron and close all window shades in the cabin to deter police snipers. Northwest Orient Seattle Operations Manager Al Lee approached the aircraft in street clothes to avoid appearing to be a police officer and delivered the cash-filled knapsack and parachutes to Mucklow via the aft stairs. Once the delivery was completed, Cooper allowed all passengers, Schaffner and senior flight attendant Alice Hancock, to leave the plane. Cooper outlined his flight plan to the cockpit crew during refueling, a southeast course toward Mexico City at the minimum airspeed possible without stalling the aircraft, approximately 100 knots maximum at 10,000-foot altitude. He further specified that the landing gear remains deployed in the takeoff landing position, the wing flaps lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin stays unpressurized. First Officer William J. Ratzik informed Cooper that the aircraft's range was limited to approximately 1,000 miles, or 1,600 kilometers, under the specific flight configuration, which meant a second refueling would be necessary before entering Mexico. Cooper and the crew discussed options and agreed on Reno, Nevada as a refueling stop. Cooper further directed that the aircraft take off with the rear exit door open and its staircase extended. Northwest's home office objected because it was unsafe to take off with the aft staircase deployed. Cooper countered that it was indeed safe, but he would not argue the point. He would lower it once they were airborne. An FAA official requested a face-to-face meeting with Cooper aboard the aircraft, which was denied. The refueling process was delayed because of a vapor lock in the fuel tanker truck's pumping mechanism, so a second truck was brought in, and they finished the refueling. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off with only Cooper, Captain Scott, Flight Attendant Mucklow, First Officer Ratzik, and Flight Engineer Harold E. Anderson on board. Two F-106 fighter aircraft from McChord Air Force Base followed behind the airliner, one above it, one below, out of Cooper's view. A Lockheed T-33 trainer, diverted from an unrelated Air National Guard mission, also shadowed the 727 before running low on fuel and turning back near the Oregon-California state line. After takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to join the rest of the crew in the cockpit and remain there with the door closed. As she complied, Mucklow observed Cooper tying something, possibly the money bag, around his waist. At approximately 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit, indicating that the aft air stair apparatus had been activated. Ratzik offered assistance via the aircraft's intercom system, which Cooper refused. That was the last communication the crew had with him. The team soon noticed a change of air pressure, indicating the aft door was open. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section sustained a sudden upward movement, large enough to require trimming to bring the plane back to level flight. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Scott and Ratzik landed the 727 with the aft air stair still deployed at Reno Airport. FBI agents, state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and Reno police surrounded the jet, as it had not yet been determined with certainty that Cooper was no longer aboard, but an armed search quickly confirmed his absence. FBI agents recovered 66 unidentified latent fingerprints aboard the airliner. The agents also found Cooper's black clip-on tie clip, and 2 of the 4 parachutes, one of which had been opened and 2 shroud lines cut from the canopy. Authorities interviewed eyewitnesses in Portland, Seattle, and Reno. A series of composite sketches were developed. Local police and FBI agents immediately began questioning possible suspects. One of the first was an Oregon man with a minor police record named D.B. Cooper. Contacted by Portland police on the off chance that the hijacker had used his real name or the same alias in a previous crime, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect, but a local reporter named James Long, rushing to meet an imminent deadline, confused the eliminated suspect's name with the pseudonym used by the hijacker. A wire service reporter, Clyde Jabin of UPI by most accounts, or Joe Frazier of the AP by others, republished the error, followed by numerous other media sources, and the name D.B. Cooper became lodged in the public's collective memory. A precise search area was challenging to define. Even slight differences in estimates of the aircraft speed or the environmental conditions along the flight path, which varied by location and altitude, changed Cooper's projected landing point considerably. An important variable was the length of time he remained in freefall before pulling his ripcord. If indeed he succeeded in opening a parachute at all, Neither of the Air Force fighter pilots saw anyone or anything exit the airliner, either visually or on radar, nor did they see a parachute open. At night, with minimal visibility and cloud cover obscuring any ground lighting below, an airborne black-clad human figure could have easily gone undetected. The T-3 pilots never made visual contact with the 727. In an experimental recreation, with Scott piloting the aircraft used in the hijacking in the same flight configuration, FBI agents pushing a 200-pound, 91-kilogram sled out of the open air stair could reproduce the upward motion of the tail section described by the flight crew at 8:13 p.m. It was concluded that at 8:13 p.m., that was the point that was most likely the jump time. At that moment, the aircraft was flying through a heavy rainstorm over the Lewis River in southwestern Washington. Initial extrapolations placed Cooper's landing zone within an area on Mount St. Helens' southernmost outreach, a few miles southeast of Ariel, Washington, near Lake Merwin, an artificial lake formed by a dam on the Lewis River. Search efforts focused on Clark and Cowlitz counties, encompassing the terrain immediately south and north of the Lewis River in southwest Washington. FBI agents and sheriff's deputies from those counties searched large mountainous wilderness areas on foot and helicopter. Door-to-door searches of local farmhouses were also carried out. Other search parties ran patrol boats on Lake Merlin and Yale Lake, the reservoir immediately to its east. No trace of Cooper, nor any of the equipment presumed to have left the aircraft with him, was found. The FBI also coordinated an aerial search using fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters from the Oregon Army National Guard along the entire flight path, known as Victor 23 in standard aviation terminology, but Vector 23 in most Cooper literature. From Seattle to Reno, although numerous broken treetops and several pieces of plastic and other objects resembling parachute canopies were sighted and investigated, nothing relevant to the hijacking was found. Shortly after the spring thaw in early 1972, teams of FBI agents aided by some 200 Army soldiers from Fort Lewis, along with Air Force personnel, National Guardsmen, and civilian volunteers conducted another thorough ground search of Clark and Cowlitz counties for 18 days in March and then an additional 18 days in April. Electronic Exploration Company, a marine salvage firm, used a submarine to search the 200-foot, 61-meter depths of Lake Merwin. Two local women stumbled upon a skeleton in an abandoned structure in Clark County. It was later identified as the remains of Barbara Ann Derry, a teenage girl who had been abducted and murdered several weeks before. Ultimately, the search and recovery operation, arguably the most extensive and intensive in U.S. history, uncovered no significant material evidence related to the hijacking. A month after the hijacking, the FBI distributed lists of the ransom serial numbers to financial institutions, casinos, racetracks, and other businesses that routinely conducted large cash transactions and law enforcement agencies worldwide. Northwest Orient offered a reward of 15% of the recovered money to a maximum of $25,000. In early 1972, U.S. Attorney General John N. Mitchell released the serial numbers to the general public. Later in 1972, two men used counterfeit $20 bills printed with Cooper's serial numbers to swindle $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter named Carl Fleming in exchange for an interview with the man they falsely claimed was the hijacker. In early 1973, with the ransom money still missing, the Oregon Journal republished the serial numbers and offered $1,000 to the first person to turn in a ransom bill to the newspaper or any FBI field office. In Seattle, the Post-Intelligencer made a similar offer with a $5,000 reward. The offers remained in effect until Thanksgiving of 1974, and though there were several near matches, no genuine bills were ever found. In 1975, Northwest Orient's insurer, Global Indemnity Company, complied with an order from the Minnesota Supreme Court and paid the airline's $180,000 claim on the ransom money. Subsequent analysis indicated that the original landing zone estimate was inaccurate. Scott, who was flying the aircraft manually because of Cooper's speed and altitude demands, later determined that his flight path was farther east than initially assumed. Additional data from various sources, particularly Continental Airlines pilot Tom Bowen, flying 4 minutes behind Flight 305, indicated that the wind direction factored into drop zone calculations had been wrong, possibly by as much as 80 degrees. This and other supplemental data suggested that the actual drop zone was southeast of the original estimate, in the drainage area of the Washougal River. Himmelsbach wrote, "I have to confess, if I were going to look for Cooper, I would head for the Washougal. The Washougal Valley and its surroundings have been searched repeatedly by private individuals and groups in subsequent years. To date, no discoveries traceable to the hijacking have been reported. Some investigators have speculated that the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens could have obliterated any remaining physical clues." On July 8th, 2016, the FBI announced that it was suspending active investigation of the Cooper case, citing a need to focus its investigative resources and workforce on higher and more urgent priority issues. Local field offices will continue to accept any legitimate physical evidence explicitly related to the parachutes or the ransom money that may emerge in the future. The 60-volume case file, compiled over the 45-year course of the investigation, will be preserved for historical purposes at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and on the FBI website. All the evidence is open to the public. 3 significant pieces of evidence were found on the plane: a black clip-on tie, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and 8 filter-tipped Raleigh cigarette butts. At some time after the hijacking, the cigarette butts were lost. In November 1978, a placard printed with instructions for lowering the aft stairs of a 727 was found by a deer hunter near a lodging road about 13 miles or 21 kilometers east of Castle Rock, Washington, well north of Lake Irwin, but within Flight 305's standard flight path. On February 10, 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the Columbia River at a beachfront known as Tina Bar, about 9 miles or 14 kilometers downstream from Vancouver, Washington, and 20 miles or 32 kilometers southwest of Ariel. He uncovered 3 packets of the ransom cash as he raked the sandy riverbank to build a campfire. The bills were disintegrated but still bundled in rubber bands. FBI technicians confirmed that the money was indeed a portion of the ransom. 2 packets of $120 bills each and a third packet of 90, all arranged in the same order as when given to Cooper. The discovery launched several new rounds of conjecture and ultimately raised more questions than it answered. The initial statements by investigators and scientific consultants were founded on the assumption that the bundled bills washed freely into the Columbia River from one of its many connecting tributaries. An Army Corps of Engineers hydrologist noted the bills had disintegrated in a rounded fashion and were matted together, indicating that they had been deposited by river action instead of being deliberately buried. That conclusion, if correct, supported the opinion that Cooper had not landed near Lake Merwin nor any tributary of the Lewis River, which feeds into the Columbia well downstream from Tina Bar. It also lent credence to supplemental speculation that placed the drop zone near the Washougal River, which merges with the Columbia upstream from the discovery site. But the free-floating hypothesis presented its own difficulties. It did not explain the 10 bills missing from one packet, nor was there a logical reason that the 3 packets would have remained together after separating from the rest of the money. Physical evidence was incompatible with geologic evidence. Himmelsbach observed that free-floating bundles would have had to wash up on the bank within a couple of years of the hijacking. Otherwise, the rubber bands would have long since deteriorated. However, geological evidence suggested that the bills arrived at Tina Bar well after 1974, the year of a Corps of Engineers dredging operation on that stretch of the river. Geologist Leonard Palmer of Portland State University found 2 distinct layers of sand and sediment between the clay deposited on the riverbank by the dredge and the sand layer in which the bills were buried, indicating that the bills arrived long after dredging had been completed. The Cooper research team later challenged Palmer's conclusion, citing evidence that the clay layer was a natural deposit. If true, that finding favors an arrival time of less than 1 year after the event based on the rubber band experiment, but does not help explain how the bundles got to Tina Bar, nor from where they came. A more recent analysis of diatoms found on the bills suggests that the bundles found at Tina Bar were not submerged in the river or buried dry at the time of the hijacking in November 1971. Only diatoms that bloomed during springtime were found, placing the date range that the money entered the water at least several months after the hijacking. Alternative theories were advanced. Some surmised the money had been found at a distant location, carried to the riverbank, and reburied there. Cowlitz County Sheriff proposed that Cooper accidentally dropped a few bundles on the air stair, which then blew off the aircraft and fell into the Columbia River. One local newspaper editor theorized that Cooper, knowing he could never spend the money, dumped it in the river or buried portions of it at Tina Bar, and possibly elsewhere, himself. No hypothesis offered to date satisfactorily explains all of the existing evidence. In 1986, after protracted negotiations, the recovered bills were divided equally between Ingram and Northwest Orient's insurer. The FBI retained 14 examples as evidence. Ingram sold 15 of his bills at auction in 2008 for about $37,000. To date, none of the 9,710 remaining bills has turned up anywhere. Their serial numbers remain available online for public search. The Columbia River ransom money and the airstair instruction placard remain the only confirmed physical evidence from the hijacking ever found outside the aircraft. In late 2007, the FBI announced that a partial DNA profile had been obtained from 3 organic samples found on Cooper's clip-on tie in 2001, though they later acknowledged that there is no evidence that the hijacker was the source of the sample material. The tie had 2 small DNA samples and 1 large sample, said Special Agent Fred Gutt. It's difficult to draw firm conclusions from these samples. The Bureau also made a public file of previously unreleased evidence, including Cooper's 1971 plane ticket, priced $20, paid in cash, and posted unreleased composite sketches and fact sheets, along with a request to the general public for information that might lead to Cooper's positive identification. They also disclosed that Cooper had chosen the older of the two primary parachutes supplied to him rather than the technically superior professional sport parachute. From the two reserve parachutes, he selected a dummy, an unusable unit with an inoperative ripcord intended for classroom demonstrations, despite it having clear markings identifying it to any experienced skydiver as non-functional. He cannibalized the other functional reserve parachute, possibly using its shrouds to tie the money bag shut and secure the bag to his body, as witnessed by Mucklow. The FBI stressed that the inclusion of the dummy reserve parachute, one of 4 obtained in haste from a Seattle skydiving school, was accidental. Or was it? In March 2009, the FBI disclosed that Tom Kay, a paleontologist from the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, assembled a team of citizen sleuths, including scientific illustrator Carol Abraxinskas. I think so. Anyway, and metallurgist Alan Stone, eventually known as the Cooper Research Team. They reinvestigated essential components of the case using GPS, satellite imagery, and other technologies unavailable in 1971. Although they gained little new information about the buried ransom money or Cooper's landing zone, they were able to find and analyze hundreds of minute particles on Cooper's tie using electron microscopy. Lycopodium spores, likely from a pharmaceutical product, were identified in fragments of bismuth and aluminum. In November 2011, Kay announced that pure unalloyed titanium particles had also been found on the tie. He explained that titanium, which was much rarer in the 1970s than in the 2010s, was at that time found only in metal fabrication or production facilities or at chemical companies using it, combined with aluminum, to store highly corrosive substances. The findings suggested that Cooper might have been a chemist or a metallurgist, or possibly an engineer or manager, the only employees who wore ties in such facilities at that time, in a metal or chemical manufacturing plant or any company that recovered scrap metal from those type of factories. In January 2017, Kay reported rare earth minerals such as cerium and strontium sulfide were also identified among the tie particles. One of the rare applications for such elements in the 1970s was Boeing's Supersonic Transport Development Project, suggesting that Cooper was a Boeing employee. Other possible sources of the material included plants that manufactured cathode ray tubes, such as the Portland firms Teledyne and Tektronix. The official physical description of Cooper has remained unchanged and is considered reliable. Flight attendants Schaffner and Mucklow, who spent the most time with Cooper, were interviewed on the same night in separate cities and gave nearly identical descriptions. Around 5 feet 10 inches or 1.78 meters tall, 180 pounds or 82 kilograms, in his mid-40s, with close-set, piercing brown eyes and swarthy skin. Cooper appeared to be familiar with the Seattle area and may have been an Air Force veteran, based on testimony that he recognized the city of Tacoma from the air as the jet circled Puget Sound. Cooper accurately commented to Mucklow that McCord Air Force Base was an approximately 20-minute drive from the Seattle-Tacoma airport, a detail most civilians would not know or comment on. His financial situation was very likely desperate. According to the FBI's retired chief investigator, Ralph Himmelsbach, extortionists and other criminals who steal large amounts of money nearly always do so because they needed it urgently. Otherwise, the crime is not worth the considerable risk. Alternatively, Cooper may have been a thrill seeker who made the jump just to prove it could be done. Agents theorized that Cooper took his alias from a popular Belgian comic series of the 1970s featuring the fictional hero Dan Cooper, a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot who took part in numerous heroic adventures, including parachuting. One cover from the series, reproduced on the FBI website, depicts test pilot Cooper skydiving in full paratrooper regalia. Because the Dan Cooper comics were never translated into English nor imported to the U.S., they speculated that he had encountered them during a tour of duty in Europe. The Cooper research team suggested the alternative possibility that Cooper was Canadian and found the comics in Canada, where they were also sold. They noted his specific demand for negotiable American currency, a phrase seldom, if ever, used by American citizens. Witnesses stated that Cooper had no noticeable accent. Canada would be Cooper's most likely country of origin if he were not a U.S. citizen. Evidence suggested that Cooper was knowledgeable about flying techniques, aircraft, and the terrain. He demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he might compel one or more hostages to jump with him, thus ensuring he would not be deliberately supplied with sabotaged equipment. He chose a 727-100 aircraft because it was ideal for a bailout escape, owing to its aft air stair and the high afterward placement of all 3 engines, which allowed a reasonably safe jump despite the proximity of the engine exhaust. It had single-point fueling capability, and then recent innovation that allowed all tanks to be refueled rapidly through a single fuel port. It also had the ability unusual for a commercial jetliner, to remain in slow, low-altitude flight without stalling. Cooper knew how to control its airspeed and altitude without entering the cockpit, where he could have been overpowered by the 3 pilots. In addition, Cooper was familiar with necessary details, such as the appropriate flap setting of 15 degrees, which was unique to that aircraft, and the typical refueling system. He knew that the aft stair could be lowered during flight, a fact never disclosed to a civilian flight crew member since there was no situation on a passenger flight that would make it necessary. Its operation, by a single switch in the rear of the cabin, could not be overridden from the cockpit. He also may have known the Central Intelligence Agency was, at the time, using 727s to drop agents and supplies behind enemy lines during the Vietnam War. According to Kay's research team, Cooper's meticulous planning might also have extended to the timing of his operation and even his choice of attire. The FBI searched but couldn't find anyone who disappeared that weekend, Kay wrote, suggesting that the perpetrator had returned to his usual occupation. If you were planning on going back to work on Monday, then you would need as much time as possible to get out of the woods, find transportation, and get home. The very best time for this is in front of a 4-day weekend, which is the timing Dan Cooper chose for his crime. Furthermore, if he was planning ahead, he knew he had to hitchhike out of the woods, and it is much easier to get picked up in a suit and tie than in old blue jeans. The author of an analysis of World War II air crew bailouts concluded that the probability of Cooper's survival might have been higher than suggested by popular opinion. Cooper, he claimed, jumped in conditions that thousands of RAF crew members survived during World War II. The FBI was more skeptical, concluding that Cooper lacked crucial skydiving skills and experience. We originally thought Cooper was an experienced jumper, perhaps even a paratrooper, said Special Agent Larry Carr, leader of the investigative team from 2006 until its dissolution in 2016. We concluded eventually that this was simply not true. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch black night in the rain with 172 mile-per-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky. He also missed that his reserve parachute was only for training and had been sewn shut, something a skilled skydiver would have checked. He also failed to bring or request a helmet, chose to jump with the older and technically inferior of the 2 primary parachutes supplied to him, and jumped into a probable 15-degree Fahrenheit or minus 9 degrees Celsius wind at 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, in November over Washington state without proper protection against the extreme wind chill. Assuming that Cooper was not a paratrooper but was an Air Force veteran, Carr suggested that he was an aircraft cargo loader. Such an assignment would have given him knowledge and experience in the aviation industry. And loaders, because they throw cargo out of flying aircraft, wear emergency parachutes and receive rudimentary jump training. Training would have given Cooper a working knowledge of parachutes, but not necessarily sufficient knowledge to survive the jump he made. The FBI speculated from the beginning that Cooper did not survive his jump. Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open, said Carr. Even if Cooper did land safely, agents contended that survival in the mountainous terrain at the onset of winter would have been all but impossible without an accomplice at a predetermined landing point and at a precisely timed jump, necessitating cooperation from the flight crew. And there's no evidence that Cooper requested or received any such help from the crew, nor that he had any clear idea where he was when he jumped into the stormy, overcast darkness. In 1976, a discussion arose over the impending expiration of the statute of limitations on the hijacking. Most published legal analysis agreed that it would make little difference, as the interpretation of the statute varies considerably from case to case and court to court, and a prosecutor could argue that Cooper had forfeited immunity on any of several valid technical grounds. In November, the question was rendered moot when a Portland grand jury returned an indictment in absentia against John Doe, aka Dan Cooper, for air piracy and violation of the Hobbs Act. The charge formally initiated prosecution that can be continued should the hijacker be apprehended at any time in the future. Between 1971 and 2016, the FBI processed over 1,000 serious suspects, including assorted publicity seekers and deathbed confessors. Cooper's apparent success inspired a flurry of imitators, 15 during 1972 alone. With the advent of universal luggage searches in 1973, the general incidence of hijackings dropped dramatically. There were no further notable Cooper and imitators until July 11th, 1980, when Glenn K. Tripp seized Northwest Flight 608 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, demanding $600,000, 2 parachutes, and the assassination of his boss. Wow. A quick-thinking flight attendant secretly drugged Tripp's alcoholic beverage with Valium. She roofied the poor guy. After a 10-hour standoff, Tripp reduced his demands to 3 cheeseburgers and a ground vehicle to escape. He was apprehended, but on January 21st, 1983, while still on probation, he hijacked the same Northwest flight. Oh, wow. This guy went back again. Wow. This time en route and demanded to be flown to Afghanistan. When the plane landed in Portland, he was shot and killed by FBI agents. Well, that didn't end so smoothly. The Cooper hijacking marked the beginning of the end for unfettered and unscrutinized commercial airline travel. Despite the initiation of the federal Sky Marshal program the previous year, 31 hijackings were committed in the U.S. airspace in 1972. 19 of them were for the specific purpose of extorting money, and most of the rest were attempts to reach Cuba. In 15 of the extortion cases, the hijackers also demanded parachutes. In early 1973, the FAA began requiring airlines to search all passengers and their bags. Amid multiple lawsuits charging that such searches violated Fourth Amendment protections against search and seizure, federal courts ruled that they were acceptable when applied universally and limited to searches for weapons and explosives. Only 2 hijackings were attempted in 1973, both by psychiatric patients. One hijacker, Samuel Bick, intended to crash the airliner into the White House to kill President Nixon. In the wake of multiple copycat hijackings in 1972, the FAA required that all Boeing 727 aircraft be fitted with a device, later dubbed the Cooper vane, that prevents lowering of the aft air stair during flight. As a direct result of the hijacking, the installation of peepholes was mandated in all cockpit doors, enabling the cockpit crew to observe passengers without opening the cockpit door. In 1978, the hijacked 727-100 aircraft was sold by Northwest to Piedmont Airlines, where it was re-registered N838N and continued in domestic carrier service. And then in 1984, it was purchased by the now-defunct charter company Key Airlines, re-registered N29KA, and incorporated into the Air Force's civilian charter fleet that shuttled workers between Nellis Air Force Base and the Tonopah Test Range during the top-secret F-117 Nighthawk development program. In 1996, the aircraft was scrapped for parts in a Memphis boneyard. On April 23, 2013, Earl J. Cossey, the owner of the skydiving school that furnished the 4 parachutes that were given to Cooper, was found dead in his home in Woodinville, a suburb of Seattle. His death was ruled a homicide due to blunt force trauma to the head. The perpetrator remains unknown. Some commenters alleged possible links to the Cooper case, but authorities responded that they have no reason to believe that any such link exists. Woodinville officials later announced that burglary was most likely the motive for the crime. So there you have it. There were so many stories when I was looking at Oregon. This one's always stuck out to me. I have no idea why, to be honest with you, but it's always fascinated me. The fact that so much time has gone by and he was so brazen. Like, he got on the flight, he bought his ticket, he sat down, he ordered his drink, he did the thing. He was just so cool and calm and collected and just did the whole thing, got the money, got off the plane. The fact that it was just like, boop, no big deal, and just disappeared into the ether like that. That's just absolutely insane. So it's always kind of stuck out to me. It's a little bizarre. And I was really cracking up because right after I got finished researching for this, I watched Loki. And in the first episode, well, I don't want to totally spoil the show for you. So spoiler alert, but in the first episode, they allude to the fact that, in the show or whatever, that Loki was DB Cooper, and I thought that was entertaining. Anyway, there you have it. That's the story of DB Cooper. I'm going to run a supplemental. It'll just be a little bonus thing going over some of the possible suspects. I was recording this episode and my first recording was corrupted after I got finished recording it. And then my second attempt at recording this episode, it sounds like I'm at the bottom of a toilet. I don't know what happened. And then I tried to fix it in Audition, and it seemed like the harder I tried, the worse it got. And I'm pretty decent with audio editing, but you would never know that because because I never apply the things I know to my own work, because that would make sense. I finally was just like, you know what? It's just a sign. It's a sign to re-record it. That's just it. I'm just going to redo it. So I did. And you have this. If you want to, you can hop over to Instagram and follow Twisted States or Disruptive Girl on Instagram. Both of them are moi. If you would like, you can check out my show notes for some affiliate links and things like that, all that fun stuff, and also resource links. I have links down below in the episode notes and in the description on YouTube for where I got my information from, and of course the link to the FBI website that has all the files there too on this case. Okay, I'm gonna go now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for hanging out. I appreciate you. Please like, share, subscribe, follow, do all the things, click all the stuff, all the buttons, and I will definitely see you next week here at Twisted States. So join me once again next week on Wednesday, sometimes Thursday, depending on how long it takes me to actually get the episode recorded. And we will dive into our next state, which next week will be Kentucky. See you then. Bye.